Hello, everybody. This is Frank with Iron Age News. It's the South Florida Conservative News Center. It is Tuesday, March 10th, and we're going to talk some more about Cuba because down here, Cuba is building and building and building, and there are a lot of questions and a lot of unanswered questions. Let's be more importantly. So everybody is coming at this from different angles because the administration has not discussed a lot of it. There was a good article. I'll put a link in the description somewhere around here that came out in, give me one second, America's Quarterly. Brian Fonseca, who's from FIU, the Gordon Institute down in Miami, and he discusses the issue with the Cuban military being inextricably tied to a lot of things. I wouldn't say like IRGC, but yeah, you know what I mean? Something going on there. So that's a good article. You'd like it if you're following this because it is yet another speed bump that the Trump people have to get over, or a hurdle, if you will, to get over. So, imagine this. Imagine you're the White House and you want Cuba to change and you want it to change fast because everything has to be done before the midterm election. You choke off the island's fuel, you threaten tariffs on any country that tries to replace it, and the lights start going out. Cuba has been in a power negative for quite some time, especially since the Venezuelan issue. And then, almost in the same breath, you're telling oil traders you can sell the fuel into Cuba again, but only to non-government Cubans. And that's what brought me back to the Fonseca article once again, because there's a couple things in there. Now, an average person, we're all average in some way, shape, or form, would say non-governmental Cubans in a communist dictatorship. So the twist is this: in Cuba, the term non-government is kind of a slippery category. Ports, storage depots, container terminals, remittance rails, and big parts of the tourist and logistics economy. They used to make rap videos there too for reggaeton. Sit inside military linked business networks, especially, and I'll just spell it GAESA, that's the initials, and under a security state where the FAR, which is the Revolutionary Army of Cuba, call it what you want, and the Interior Ministry's intelligence and internal security organs don't have to own a firm on paper to influence it. So this is a clever strategy to empower real entrepreneurs, or is it just yet another shadow game where private sector channels become a regime approved disguise? We're rebranding the same elites with new faces. They're bright and they're shiny again. They'll shave the beard, as we would say. So I haven't. Let me say what can we say about this as the timeout just timed out. Sorry about that, guys. You know how these things are. Operationally, as we're going to say, Cuba's state choke points, the importers, the state approved storage, and state controlled distribution mean private sector fuel can still generate fees, rents, and leverage. There are a good number of hotels that are down there. I think most of them are owned by the Canadians. There is one of the largest nickel mines in the world, which is down there near MOA, MOA, which is a Canadian shade tree, but produces nickel from Cuba. They have a small amount of either gas or natural gas or oil that they are able to mine too. So there's a few things in there. And of course, whatever they can still get out of their agriculture. So when we say private sector here, private sector fuel, that's where these fees or rents or leverage would come from for regime linked structures, even when the end user is genuinely private. Okay. As we just said, with the hotels and all that type of thing. It's too strong to claim most private actors are Republican, Revolutionary Army or the DGI, which is the KGB of Cuba. but it's fully justified to say elite capture risk is high because ownership is opaque and key infrastructure is adjacent, for lack of a better term. So we can talk here now about the hard facts, the U.S. moves that are on the record. First and foremost, the Trump White House issued an executive order on January 29th, 2026, declaring a national emergency and building a tariff system. The key mechanic is an additional ad valorem duty may be imposed on imports from any foreign country that directly or indirectly sells or provides crude oil or petroleum products to Cuba. The EO explicitly defines indirectly as including intermediaries and third parties. If there is knowledge, the oil may be provided to Cuba. Full stop. Second, the Treasury's office published a document announcing a favorable licensing policy for resales of Venezuelan origin oil for use in Cuba, but only if the transaction supports the Cuban people, including the Cuban private sector, and does not involve or benefit excluded parties. Cuban military, Cuban intelligence services, and other government institutions, Cuba restricted list entities, or Cuban-owned financial institutions. It also requires contractual and compliance measures to ensure no later transactions benefit excluded parties directly or indirectly. I know what I'm going to tell you right now is this is important to have in here. If it's making you sleepy, that's fine. It makes me sleepy sometimes. You can go to our Substack or www.southfloridaconservative.com. We'll have written versions with more detail on this subject. So that's that. And the last one is under all this, yet another law which bars direct financial transactions with entities the State Department identifies as linked to Cuban military intelligence or security services. It also includes a key nuance here. Entities owned or controlled by a listed entity are not automatically restricted unless names. That creates a new compliance gap. New fronts can appear faster than list updates, as you can imagine. Raul Castro is busily putting together NGOs as we speak, so to circumvent this thing. So private sector fuel, how is it supposed to work? How do you have a private sector in a totalitarian communist system? Well, we just said it's going to be gray and shady and touch on a lot of different disreputable folks, but in general, it is supposed to be independent of the Reds. So the operational vision, how this is supposed to function in the real world, and this is, I used Reuters. There's a few in here that I wanted you to have mainstream because it can't always be the truth, right? So Reuters reporting on the February 25th policy change frames it as giving trading houses and suppliers legal cover through licenses to resell Venezuelan oil into Cuba's private sector while keeping government and military beneficiaries excluded. What is occurring is the money changes hands and goes into American approved accounts. The Americans then decide who's allowed to have money and who's not. So Comandante Zero does not get a piece of the action off the top. It must be somewhere down in the mix. But we also identify what is considered a legitimate price for the products. You can't get $72,000 a barrel for oil because we know it's a lie. And of course, there's going to be some price fixing in there. And the US government's intent is echoed in explanatory reporting. The idea is that fuel can reach small businesses and humanitarian operators without flowing through government hands. Anything that the government touches down there tends to stick to it. And this creates leverage for market-like reforms. Sidebar here, and I'm just throwing it in, which I don't want to throw you guys off. Years back, Brazil was going to go in there and put together like a tax-free zone at one of the ports. They were going to build the entire port themselves, and they were going to make it where everything that transpired there did not have a VAT tax, value-added tax, and things could move from wherever it had to move at that point, which was a big saver for the Brazilians because the Brazilians love to tax shit and they love to add VAT to everything. Plus, their agreement at that time, I'd have to check it again, but I'm pretty sure the story was they were not trying to overthrow the communists. So you could be a communist country that had a capitalist section that was pretty much just going to benefit the Communist Party. Now you're talking of, I guess, a variation on what the Brazilians wanted, except the money will go into restoring the country. As far as I have heard from a number of people, and War on the Rocks will tell you that I'm no professional, um, the United States government does not want to put money into Cuba. This is same as they didn't want to put money into Venezuela. The problem with Cuba is it does not export enough to make it super valuable. What it is super valuable for is getting the effing Russians and Chinese surveillance posts out of the island, which is probably the number one priority that we haven't heard about, which is also probably why they're dealing with these questionable private or entities that exist. But anybody who saw any old prison war movie, they know there's always that guy who's cutting deals with the guards. That's who we're hoping is going to be involved in this oil thing, believe it or not, right? So, anyway, back to what we were talking about. So, the government's intent here under this, how the private fuel sector thing is going to work, is that, as I said, it'll reach these small businesses. It'll give them a chance to start to build themselves up because we know that the communists' 5-year plans and stuff are always a failure. There are a number of things that you'll have to do under that. There's a number of ways you will get paid under that. And you'll see those again on the document pages that we have over at Substack and over at southfloridaconservative.com. So the key reality check here is even if the buyer is truly private, the pathway often runs through state-controlled infrastructure. The thing with a communist dictatorship is it controls all aspects of life. It's very hard to escape it, even in a corroded situation such as Cuba. The Cuban government controls motor fuel distribution and power supply through state companies. That is the enormous checkpoint. So the CEDA adds another highly relevant detail. When Cuba allowed certain organizations to import fuel in early February, purchases reportedly had to run through state-run importers, and fuel had to be stored in state-approved facilities. Honestly, I can understand that because what other facilities could there be? That means the state can skim, delay, deny, fill up their tank anytime they want to, give it to their abuela, whatever they want to do, whether or not the buyer is a regime loyalist. Okay. So now you had infrastructure control. The United States Department has Cuba restricted lists, okay, which identifies nodes and people and organizations that we do not want to play with. And they are on there. Now, how do you avoid them? Right. So there's a lot of intricate Game of Thronesian, for lack of a better term, stuff going on here. So even if Washington is trying to root around the regime, the physical supply chain often passes through spaces where regime-linked entities can collect the rent. That's the shadow risk. The government doesn't have to be the buyer to still profit like a gatekeeper. Now, are they thinking about doing something out of Guantanamo Bay? It wouldn't really make sense because Guantanamo Bay is on the bottom of the island and away from the majority of this business, which is going to go on in Havana. But it's also down there near a major mining site for nickel, Moa, which is one of the lifelines of hard currency coming out of Cuba. I haven't heard what we're going to do there because one or two of the properties attached to the nickel mining were American mining companies that were nationalized during the revolution. The company that is there now is a Canadian company. So that's another thing that is going to have to be discussed. So what are we going to say here? Are we going to say the Cuban private firms are independent or are they elite proxies? Is this another situation of Vladimir Putin owns NKVD orange importers, and the Russians enjoy a lot of oranges, that type of thing. A balanced answer to this to start with is that Cuba's private sector is real and growing. My mother was there with a missionary thing, I guess 2 years before COVID, maybe 2017. Maybe it was 2017. And there were all these little hustlers. Everybody was hustling. Not everybody. That's going to be the other thing. People that were hustling were hustling. People that were happy to be on welfare were happy to be on welfare. Sort of the sign of the times, right? So Reuters, again, just for you people out there, because this is coming from our written documents, reported the Cubans' non-state sector accounted for 55% of retail sales by value in 2024. And you say, well, where are all these guys getting this money from? Well, if you knew average Cubans in Miami, there was up until very, very recently, because of the immigration crackdown, a lot of back and forth, a lot of guys with money strapped to their bodies, such as is life. A lot of boats coming into the coast and then going back out later. A lot of shit was going on. So that is sometimes how Luis ended up with 50,000 US in a country that 50,000 US hasn't been in quite some time. So 55% of retail sales by value in 2024, which surpasses the state, was based on small businesses. And in the fuel context, the administration's own narrative via the reporting is that it's trying to treat the private sector as both a real and a potential strategic partner to relieve the humanitarian crisis. A lot of this is going to remind you of how China has its billionaires, but at some point they get stripped of all their value and they're shot in their head, and then you never see them again. I had hoped it would be more along the lines of a Vietnam communism, where they're sit in the background more, but they really have a lot more independent business going on. Plus, they're anti-Chinese. They always got that going for it. So we're going to have to worry about the independence of this, which is separate from the idea of their existence. So what you're going to see then, as I said, we're going to just have to go from there. Beneficial ownership for these companies is going to just be opaque. You're not going to see through. So that is going to be a major issue. I don't think I'm belaboring it for obvious reasons, and there's nothing that you need to worry about from that. Now, when people tell you that they can't make a deal down there unless you're dealing with the FAR, which is the military revolutionary army, let's say, we'll just call them that. It's like the Red Guard. It's like the Reds Guards kind of guys. And then there is also an organization, the DGI, which is like the KGB. People a lot of times will say, well, the FAR, you know, everything down here moves through them. And I think that there needed to be that segmentation so you understand that there is a difference. They have a lot of similarities. We'll do a special thing just on that so you understand. But it's going to be similar to they're going to be like a mafia, I'm assuming, for lack of a better term, when this thing continues to go forward. So on Cuba, the long-running pattern has been when the state opens a sector to earn foreign exchange, it often does so in a way that preserves political control. Now, if you see Brookings' work on Cuban tourism and the opening logic in the 1990s, they're going to show you how Cuba leaned into tourism and foreign partnerships after the Soviet collapse to restore hard currency inflows. Okay, on the evasion side, the U.S. Treasury explicitly describes these type of structures as sanctioned evasion, including the use of Panamanian corporations and stuff like that, which the boys are very good at. The question is going to be, where did they hide all the money they stole from Venezuela? That is going to be another question that we'll have to deal with as things go along. So anyway, long and the short of this, because I've gone on too long on this with minutia, those of you who want to know the real, as I said before, the heavy details, go to the tech sites, Substack or South Florida Conservative. It's going to be tough for the administration to deal with somebody who is 100% not touched by the communists. In fact, I will tell you it would be impossible. And I'm expecting the news services to jump around with glee when they find a socialist communist connection between the guy who is now in charge of importing all the umbrellas into Cuba, and there's a picture with him kissing Raul Castro on the ass. You're not going to get what you want out of a place like this. What we're looking for is a stability where we do not have huge inflows of migrants again, as we have had in the past with them. We are interested in the people that are here helping out down there to some extent without getting a lot of pushback from the communists, even though they are, cats and dogs as how they will fight. And if that can be accomplished and it keeps itself reasonably secure, and on day one, we're allowed to go down and dynamite those Russian and Chinese listening posts, I think you're going to see the turnaround in the government. Cuba can learn to behave itself. The problem Cuba has always had under Castro and everything, and it's well worth the study to understand what went on, is their intelligence forces and their revolutionary army used to sell itself out. You see them fighting in El Salvador, you saw them fighting in Africa and 2 or 3 wars over there. They went wherever there was money available. So they needed to keep bringing money in. They had a country that had no oil. They had a country that had no gold. They had no nothing except communism and the desire to succeed, I guess you could say. And they did a pretty darn good job of it, because when you're in that business, you're not worried about human suffering because they're suckers. If they weren't suckers, they would be in the air-conditioned car with me. So I hope that sort of gives you an idea of what is facing the diplomatic corps when dealing with this Cuban situation. Maybe I made it a little more fuzzy. I'm sorry, but there's a lot going on, and we have 10 minutes to do it in when we're doing videos, or 15 minutes to do it when you're doing videos. But if you're interested in the topic, like I said, go to those pages. If you're interested in the topic and there's something we haven't covered and you'd like us to cover it, we will do that. We're all about that. We're not worried about the millions of dollars that we make on YouTube, because I think we got like 20 viewers on YouTube. Rumble and BitChute are our main operation. YouTube, what are you going to do, right? But we're here to add information that you may not otherwise get, which you sometimes don't even get in the regular journals, because, as we know, it's get in line, stand in line, shut your mouth, and you'll get your chance to have your article yourself. It's unfortunately how the world is working, and that is why academia kind of sucks the dicks that it does right now. So otherwise, you have a great day. It's going to be like 88 degrees here, and I got to include the filters out of the air conditioner. I will talk to you all later on. Goodbye.